The autumn leaves danced gently outside Westminster Abbey as Prince William adjusted his navy blue tie one more time. Beside him, Princess Kate smoothed down her emerald green coat dress, her fingers trembling slightly. They both knew today would be different from their usual royal engagements. Today, they would meet the families who had lost everything in the recent Manchester apartment fire that had claimed 17 lives, including 9 children. The royal couple had insisted on keeping this visit low-key, with minimal press coverage. They wanted the focus to remain on the families, not on themselves. As their car pulled up to the community center where the families had gathered, William reached over and squeezed Kate's hand. No words were needed between them. They had discussed this moment extensively the night before, lying awake as parents themselves, imagining the unthinkable grief these families were experiencing. Inside the community center, the atmosphere was heavy with sorrow. Photographs of the victims lined the walls, smiling faces frozen in time, children playing in parks, elderly couples celebrating anniversaries, teenagers in school uniforms. Each image told a story that had been cut tragically short. The prince and princess entered quietly, their usual formal entrance protocol abandoned at their request. Sarah Mitchell sat in the corner, clutching a teddy bear that had belonged to her 6-year-old daughter, Emma. She had not spoken to anyone since the tragedy 3 days ago. The social workers had tried everything, but Sarah remained locked in her silent grief. Her husband, Tom, sat beside her, his own eyes red and swollen from crying. They had lost both their daughters in the fire while they were at work, trusting that their home was safe. As William and Kate moved through the room, speaking softly with each family, sharing tears and offering comfort, they noticed Sarah. Kate's motherly instincts immediately drew her attention to the woman holding the teddy bear. She whispered something to William, who nodded in understanding. They had 3 children of their own at home, and the thought of such loss was unbearable. The princess approached Sarah slowly, not wanting to intrude on her grief. She knelt down beside her, bringing herself to eye level with the grieving mother. For a long moment, Kate said nothing. She simply sat there, present in the silence. Then, very gently, she reached out and placed her hand over Sarah's hand that clutched the teddy bear. Sarah looked up for the first time in days, meeting Kate's eyes. What she saw there was not pity or formal sympathy, but the raw understanding of one mother to another. Kate's eyes were filled with tears, and in that moment, no royal protocol existed. It was simply one human being connecting with another in their darkest hour. William had moved to sit beside Tom, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. The 2 men sat in silence, understanding that sometimes there were no words adequate for such profound loss. The prince's presence alone spoke volumes, offering a strength that Tom desperately needed. As the visit continued, something remarkable began to happen. Other families started to gather around, drawn by the genuine compassion radiating from the royal couple. There were no cameras capturing these moments, no official photographers. This was real, unscripted human connection. An elderly woman named Margaret, who had lost her son and daughter-in-law in the fire and was now caring for her 3 orphaned grandchildren, approached William. Her hands shook as she tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. The prince, seeing her struggle, gently took both her hands in his and simply nodded, acknowledging her pain without requiring her to voice it. Kate, meanwhile, had sat down on the floor with a group of children who had lost friends in the fire. She didn't try to cheer them up with false brightness. Instead, she listened as they talked about their friends, validating their grief and letting them know it was okay to feel sad. One little boy named James, who had lost his best friend, showed her a drawing he had made. It was a picture of 2 boys playing football together, with angels' wings drawn on one of them. The princess studied the drawing carefully, treating it with the respect it deserved. She asked James about his friend, encouraging him to share happy memories. As the boy talked, other children joined in, sharing their own memories. Kate listened to each one, her full attention on these young souls who were trying to process a tragedy beyond their years. The hours passed unnoticed. The royal couple had been scheduled to stay for just 45 minutes, but they remained for over 3 hours. Their staff waited patiently outside, understanding that this was not about schedules or protocols. This was about humanity. As the afternoon sun began to set, casting golden light through the community center windows, something shifted in the room. The crushing silence that had dominated the space began to ease, replaced by quiet conversations and even the occasional sound of a child's laugh as they remembered a funny story about their lost friend. Sarah Mitchell had begun to speak, telling Kate about her daughter's love for dancing and how they would put on shows in their living room every evening. The princess listened intently, occasionally sharing her own stories about Charlotte's love for ballet, creating a bridge of understanding between them. The visit was drawing to a close, but William and Kate seemed reluctant to leave. They had connected with every single family in the room, and each goodbye felt too final. It was then that the prince had an idea. He whispered something to Kate, who immediately understood and nodded. The couple moved to the center of the room, gathering everyone's attention without saying a word. What happened next would become a moment etched in the nation's collective memory, though very few would actually witness it firsthand. The power of their next action would ripple out from this small community center to touch hearts across the entire country. Standing in the center of the room, William and Kate looked at each other with a deep understanding that comes from years of partnership. The prince cleared his throat softly, not to speak, but to center himself for what they were about to do. Kate's hand found his, their fingers intertwining as they had done countless times before, but never with such profound purpose. Without a word, the royal couple slowly bent their heads and closed their eyes. In complete silence, they stood there, holding hands in the middle of the grieving families. It took a moment for everyone to understand what was happening. The prince and princess were praying, but more than that, they were inviting everyone to join them in a moment of collective remembrance. One by one, families began to stand. Tom Mitchell helped Sarah to her feet, still clutching Emma's teddy bear. Margaret gathered her grandchildren close. The children Kate had been sitting with formed a small circle. Soon, everyone in the room was standing, creating an unplanned circle of solidarity around William and Kate. The silence was profound, but it was no longer the suffocating silence of grief. It had transformed into something sacred, a shared moment of love and remembrance for those lost. Some people prayed. Others simply stood with their eyes closed, thinking of their loved ones. A few wept quietly, but even their tears felt different now, less alone. After what felt like both an eternity and mere seconds, William and Kate raised their heads. Their eyes were wet with tears, but there was something else there too. A strength that seemed to flow from them to everyone in the circle. Still without speaking, the couple began to move slowly around the circle. At each person they stopped at, William and Kate would pause. Sometimes they would place a gentle hand on a shoulder. Sometimes they would take someone's hands in theirs. For the children, Kate would kneel down to their level, often touching their faces gently or smoothing their hair in a maternal gesture that needed no words. William would often place his hand over his heart and then gesture toward the person, a silent message that said, "I carry your pain in my heart." When they reached Sarah Mitchell, something extraordinary happened. Kate, still kneeling from comforting a child, looked up at Sarah and slowly, deliberately, removed the small gold locket she always wore. It was a simple piece, nothing ostentatious, but anyone who followed the royals knew it contained photos of her own children. Without a word, she pressed it into Sarah's free hand, closing the grieving mother's fingers around it. Sarah's eyes widened in shock, and she tried to give it back, shaking her head. But Kate simply placed her hands over Sarah's, holding them closed around the locket, and shook her head gently. Her eyes said what words could not. "Mother to mother, I want you to have this. You are not alone." The gesture was so unexpected, so deeply personal, that several people in the room gasped softly. This was not a princess performing a duty. This was a mother recognizing another mother's pain and offering a piece of her own heart as comfort. William, witnessing his wife's gesture, was moved to his own action. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, worn prayer card. Those close enough to see recognized it as the one he had carried since his mother Diana's funeral, a private talisman he had kept for over 2 decades. He had been photographed with it only once, by accident, and had guarded it as one of his most precious possessions. He walked over to Marcus Chen, a young man who had lost both parents in the fire and was now responsible for his 2 younger siblings. Marcus had been trying so hard to be strong, to be the rock his siblings needed, but William could see the cracks in his armor. The prince pressed the prayer card into Marcus's hand, gripping the young man's shoulder firmly. Their eyes met, and in that gaze, Marcus found permission to not always be strong, to grieve, to be human. The royal couple continued their silent journey around the circle, and at each stop, something profound occurred. They gave away personal items, small things that might seem insignificant to outsiders but were clearly meaningful to them. Kate gave her handkerchief, embroidered with her children's initials, to a grandmother. William offered his cufflinks, a gift from his father, to a man who had lost his brother. But more than physical items, they gave pieces of themselves. When they reached a teenage girl named Amira who had lost her mother, Kate did something that broke all protocol. She pulled the girl into a full embrace, holding her as Amira sobbed into her shoulder. The princess's own tears fell freely as she stroked the girl's hair, whispering the only words she would speak during this entire ritual. "She's still with you. Always." William knelt beside a 7-year-old boy named Oliver, who hadn't spoken since the fire. The prince didn't try to make him talk. Instead, he simply sat beside him, shoulder to shoulder, 2 people sharing a moment of understanding. After a few minutes, Oliver leaned against William, and the prince put his arm around the boy, holding him as a father would his own son. The community center had become a sanctuary of shared grief and healing. Outside, the few photographers who had been allowed to document the visit from a distance could see through the windows that something remarkable was happening. But they couldn't capture it. Some moments were too sacred for cameras. As the silent ceremony continued, word began to spread. The staff waiting outside whispered to each other about what they were witnessing through glimpses. One of the security officers, a hardened veteran of many royal visits, was seen wiping tears from his eyes. A police officer who had worked the scene of the fire had to step away, overwhelmed by the genuine compassion he was witnessing. Inside, the circle had become fluid, with people moving to comfort each other, inspired by William and Kate's example. The royal couple had started something that took on a life of its own. Strangers were embracing, sharing their grief, finding solace in their shared experience. The children who had been sitting with Kate earlier were now comforting other children, mimicking her gentle gestures. As the natural light in the room began to fade, someone lit a candle. Then another. Soon, the room was illuminated by dozens of small flames, each one lit in memory of someone lost. William and Kate stood again in the center, watching as the families they had come to comfort were now comforting each other. The transformation in the room was palpable. Where there had been isolated islands of grief, there was now a connected community. The silence continued, but it had evolved from something that separated to something that united. In choosing not to speak, William and Kate had said more than any speech could have conveyed. The candles flickered, casting dancing shadows on the walls, playing across the photographs of those lost. In that light, the images seemed less like monuments to tragedy and more like celebrations of lives lived, however briefly. The prince and princess stood hand in hand, tears streaming down both their faces, as they witnessed the power of human connection in its purest form. Finally, as if by some unspoken agreement, the circle began to break naturally. But instead of returning to isolation, people stayed connected. Small groups formed, conversations began in hushed tones. The healing that had started would continue long after this day ended. William and Kate prepared to leave, but their departure was nothing like their arrival. There was no formal goodbye, no official ending. Instead, they moved quietly through the room one more time, sharing final embraces, touching hands, exchanging looks that said everything. As they reached the door, the entire room turned to watch them go. And then, in a moment that would be whispered about for years to come, everyone in the room began to applaud. It started with just one person, Sarah Mitchell, who put down her daughter's teddy bear for the first time since the fire to bring her hands together. The sound spread through the room like a wave. Not the formal applause given to royalty, but something deeper, more primal. It was gratitude, yes, but also recognition of a shared humanity that transcended all boundaries. William and Kate turned back to the room, and in perfect synchronization, they placed their hands over their hearts and bowed deeply. Not the formal bow of royalty, but the profound bow of one human being honoring others. They held it for a long moment, and when they raised their heads, there was not a dry eye in the room, including their own. As William and Kate's car pulled away from the community center, neither of them spoke. Kate clutched William's hand tightly, both of them processing what had just occurred. They had attended hundreds of official engagements, met thousands of people in times of joy and sorrow, but nothing had ever felt quite like this. They had given away pieces of themselves, literally and figuratively, and in return had received something invaluable, a reminder of why their roles truly mattered. Back at the community center, the families remained long after the royal departure. The spell that had been cast was not easily broken. Marcus Chen, still holding William's prayer card, found himself talking to Tom Mitchell about the burden of sudden responsibility. Sarah Mitchell, wearing Kate's locket, was showing Amira photos of her daughters, the first time she had been able to share happy memories since the fire. Outside, the small group of photographers and journalists who had been permitted to cover the visit from a distance were struggling with an unusual problem. They had been instructed to maintain respectful distance, and through the windows, they had witnessed something extraordinary. But how could they convey in words or images what had essentially been a silent event? How could they capture the power of absence of words? One photographer, James Crawford, a veteran of 30 years who had covered everything from wars to royal weddings, sat in his car staring at his camera. He had taken photos through the window of the circle forming, of the candlelight vigil, but he knew these images couldn't convey what he had witnessed. For the first time in his career, he considered not filing a story at all. Some moments, he thought, were too sacred to reduce to pixels and print, but word of what had happened began to spread in the way that truly powerful moments do, through whispered conversations and private messages. The security officer called his wife that evening, his voice breaking as he tried to describe what he had seen. The police officer who had worked the fire scene told his colleagues at the station, struggling to find words for something that had been wordless. Staff members at the community center shared their observations with friends and family. By the next morning, something unusual was happening across social media. Instead of the typical royal photos and headlines, people were sharing simple messages. They gave pieces of themselves. No words needed. Humanity over protocol. There were no clear photos, no video footage, just accounts from those who had been there or heard from someone who had. The absence of visual documentation made the event more powerful, not less. In an age of constant photography and video, the fact that this moment existed only in memory and testimony gave it an almost mythical quality. People had to use their imagination, had to feel, rather than simply see. The first news report came from an unexpected source. Margaret, the grandmother caring for her orphaned grandchildren, had called a local radio station. Her voice trembling with emotion, she had simply said, "I need people to know what happened yesterday, not for sensation, but because it might help others who are grieving." The radio host, prepared for a typical interview about meeting the royals, found himself silent as Margaret described the wordless ceremony, the circle of grief and solidarity, the personal sacrifices made by William and Kate. As her account aired, the station's phones lit up. Other families from the community center called in, each adding their piece to the mosaic of memory. Sarah Mitchell spoke publicly for the first time since losing her daughters, her voice stronger than it had been in days. She talked about the locket, about the moment of connection with Kate, about how that simple gesture had somehow given her permission to both grieve and hope. The story spread across Britain like wildfire, but not in the typical manner of royal news. There were no sensational headlines, no exclusive photos to sell newspapers. Instead, there was something more profound. A collective recognition of authentic compassion. Radio hosts found themselves emotional on air. Television presenters paused mid-sentence, moved by the accounts they were sharing. In palaces and offices across London, senior royal staff were initially concerned. This was completely off protocol. Personal items had been given away. Physical boundaries had been crossed. There were no official photos to release, but as they monitored public reaction, they realized something remarkable was happening. This unscripted, undocumented moment was doing more for the monarchy's connection with the people than 100 carefully planned events. The Queen herself, upon hearing the full account, was said to have sat in silence for a long moment before simply saying, "They understood. They truly understood." She immediately penned personal notes to William and Kate, not as their sovereign, but as a grandmother proud of who they had become. In homes across Britain, families gathered around their televisions and radios, listening to the accounts. Parents held their children a little tighter. Those who had experienced loss found themselves reaching out to others who were grieving. The simple act of standing in silent solidarity became something people began to do in their own communities. Churches, mosques, synagogues, and temples across the nation began holding silent vigils for the Manchester victims. But more than that, they became spaces where people could share their own grief. Inspired by the royal example that grief shared is grief diminished. The circular formation that had spontaneously occurred at the community center was replicated in town squares and parks across the country. A week after the visit, something extraordinary happened. Without any official organization, people began leaving flowers and candles outside the Manchester Community Center, but also outside royal residences. The messages attached were different from usual royal well wishes. They were thank you notes, not for a royal visit, but for a human moment. "Thank you for showing us how to grieve together," read one. "Your silence spoke louder than any words," said another. Children in schools across Britain began observing moments of silence not just for official remembrances, but for classmates going through difficult times. Teachers reported that students were more empathetic, more willing to support each other without needing to fill silence with empty words. The impact reached beyond Britain's borders. News outlets worldwide struggled to explain why a silent gesture with no official footage had captured a nation's heart. Grief counselors and psychologists appeared on programs to discuss the power of presence over words, of shared silence over spoken comfort. The phrase, "the British silence," began trending globally. But it meant something different than the stereotypical British reserve. It meant the power of being present with others in their pain. William and Kate, watching the response unfold, were deeply moved. They had not intended to start a movement. They had simply responded to human suffering with their own humanity. But in doing so, they had reminded a nation that sometimes the most powerful thing we can do for each other is simply to be present. To share the burden of grief, without trying to fix it with words. A month later, at the official memorial service for the fire victims, something unprecedented happened. As the service began, the entire congregation, including the royal family, stood in complete silence for 5 full minutes. No prayers were spoken, no music played, just thousands of people standing together, sharing a moment of profound connection. When the silence finally broke, it was with the sound of children singing, the youth choir made up of classmates of the young victims. Their voices, clear and strong, sang not of sadness but of hope and memory. In the royal box, William and Kate stood hand in hand, tears flowing freely, no longer concerned with protocol or cameras. After the service, families from the community center were invited to a private reception. Sarah Mitchell approached Kate, still wearing the locket. She opened it to show that alongside photos of the royal children, she had added tiny pictures of her own daughters. The two mothers embraced. No words needed. Marcus Chen found William in the crowd and silently showed him the prayer card, now worn from daily handling. The young man's siblings stood with him, and William knelt to greet them, remembering each of their names from that day at the center. The prince noticed that Marcus stood taller now, still carrying responsibility but no longer crushed by it. As the reception continued, it became clear that something lasting had been forged in that silent moment at the community center. The families had formed a support network, meeting regularly, helping each other through the waves of grief. They had taken the royal example and made it their own, understanding that healing came not from moving on but from moving forward together. The nation had been brought to tears not by tragedy alone, but by the recognition of what was possible when people chose compassion over protocol, presence over words, and shared humanity over hierarchy. In years to come, when people spoke of William and Kate's defining moment as future king and queen, they would not speak of grand ceremonies or state occasions. They would speak of the day they chose silence, and in doing so, gave voice to a nation's grief and hope. The ripple effects continued long after the headlines faded. Community centers across Britain adopted the Circle of Silence as a way to support grieving families. Mental health organizations reported increases in people seeking help, inspired by the message that sharing grief was not weakness but strength. The phrase, silent gesture, entered the common vocabulary, meaning any act of profound compassion that transcended words. William and Kate never spoke publicly about that day in detail. When asked in interviews, they would simply say that they had done what felt right in the moment. But those who knew them well noticed changes. They hugged their children a little longer each night. They incorporated more unscripted moments into their official visits. They understood, in a way that can only come from experience, that their greatest power lay not in their titles, but in their humanity. The items they had given away that day were never seen again in public, staying with the families who treasured them, not for their royal connection, but for what they represented. The moment when princes and princesses became simply William and Kate, and in doing so, helped a nation remember what it meant to be human. In the end, the silent gesture that brought a nation to tears was not about sadness alone. It was about the discovery that in our shared silence, we find our common voice. In our willingness to simply be present with each other's pain, we discover the pathway to healing. And in the space between words, we often find the truest expressions of love, compassion, and hope. The Manchester families continued to meet, their circle growing to include others who had experienced loss. And always, they would begin their gatherings the same way. Standing together in silence, hands joined, remembering that sometimes the most powerful thing we can say is nothing at all. In that silence, they found strength. In that strength, they found hope. And in that hope, they found their way forward